The moment I stood in that drafty attic, surrounded by dusty boxes and forgotten memories, I knew something had fundamentally changed. My own daughter, Caroline, had insisted, that I stay here instead of my usual guest room. "Mom, we need the space for Jason's parents," she'd explained with that tight smile I'd come to recognize. The one that said I wasn't a priority anymore. After 40 years of putting her first, of building a life around her happiness, I found myself relegated to the margins of her world. What Caroline didn't realize as she handed me those threadbare blankets was that I had already started meeting with my attorney. My will was changing, just as surely as my place in this family had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the day I bought Caroline her first home. She was 28, newly married to Jason, and struggling to put together a down payment in the overpriced Boston housing market. I'd been saving since her birth, tucking away bonuses from my accounting firm, investing carefully, living modestly in my small 2-bedroom apartment while she attended private schools and summer camps. "Mom, we found the perfect place," she'd gushed over the phone, "but we're still about $60,000 short for the down payment." I didn't hesitate. "I'll transfer it tomorrow, sweetheart." That was 5 years ago. Since then, I'd helped them renovate their kitchen, contributed to their European vacation fund, and babysat their 2 children, my grandchildren, Emma and Leo, whenever they needed a night out or a weekend away. I never complained. After losing Caroline's father to cancer when she was just 12, I'd dedicated myself to ensuring she never felt the absence of anything else in her life. My relationship with Caroline had always been close, or so I thought. We spoke daily, shared weekend brunches, and celebrated every holiday together. She'd call me for advice on everything from recipes to career moves. I was her confidant, her support system, her mother. Jason, her husband, was pleasant enough in the beginning. He worked in finance, came from a well-connected family, and seemed to adore Caroline. I appreciated how he included me in their lives, inviting me to dinners and calling me Mom Helen instead of the more formal Mrs. Parker. But something shifted after Emma was born. "Helen, we were thinking," Jason had said during a Sunday dinner at their house, "maybe you could watch Emma 3 days a week? Daycare is so expensive, and we don't want strangers raising our daughter." I was 62 then, still working full-time at the accounting firm where I'd built my career over 30 years. I'd planned to retire at 65, maybe travel a bit, join that book club my friend Diane kept mentioning. But Caroline looked at me with those hopeful eyes, the same ones that had convinced me to buy her that ridiculously expensive prom dress all those years ago. "Of course," I said, rearranging my life once again. I negotiated a part-time schedule at work, sacrificing part of my retirement contributions and senior status. My colleagues were surprised. I'd always been career-focused, reliable, the one who stayed late to finish projects. "You're sure about this, Helen?" my boss had asked, concern evident in her voice. "You've worked so hard to get where you are." "Family comes first," I replied, with the certainty I'd always felt. For 2 years, I maintained this arrangement, working mornings, rushing to Caroline's home to care for Emma each afternoon, preparing dinner for the family before exhaustedly driving home. When Leo was born, the demands only increased. "Mom, we need you 5 days now," Caroline said, not really asking. "Jason got promoted and I'm going back to work full-time." I retired earlier than planned, consoling myself with the joy of being close to my grandchildren. I watched Emma take her first steps, heard Leo's first words. I was there for it all, the constant, loving grandmother. The subtle shift in how they treated me was almost imperceptible at first. Caroline stopped asking about my day. Jason's friendly Mom Helen became just Helen, then sometimes nothing at all, just a nod as he rushed past me to his home office. The children were my comfort, running to me with open arms, sharing their small discoveries and disappointments. My friends noticed the change before I allowed myself to. "Helen, when was the last time you did something for yourself?" Diane asked one rare evening when I'd managed to join her for coffee. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," I insisted, even as I stifled a yawn. "The kids keep me young." Diane didn't look convinced. "And what about Caroline? Is she appreciating everything you do?" The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Instead, I changed the subject, asking about Diane's recent cruise to Alaska. But later, alone in my apartment, I found myself turning the question over in my mind. Was Caroline appreciating me? Or had I become a convenience, a reliable support system taken utterly for granted? The holidays had always been my favorite time, the one period when I felt my efforts were truly recognized. I'd host elaborate Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations, cooking for days, decorating every inch of my modest apartment, carefully selecting personalized gifts for everyone. Caroline would help in the kitchen, reminiscing about holidays past, thanking me profusely for making everything so special, Mom. So, when Caroline called last October to discuss the upcoming Thanksgiving, I was already planning my menu. "Mom, we've been thinking," she began, her voice carrying that tone that usually preceded a request. "We want to host Thanksgiving this year. Jason's parents are coming and our house has more space." "Oh," I said, caught off guard. "Of course, that makes sense. I can bring my sweet potato casserole and the cranberry relish everyone loves." "Actually," Caroline continued, "Jason's mom is quite particular about the menu. She's been hosting their family Thanksgiving for 30 years, and she has her traditional dishes. Maybe you could handle dessert? She doesn't really bake." I felt a small sting but pushed it aside. "Sure, sweetheart. I can make my apple pie and the chocolate pecan tart Jason likes." "Perfect," Caroline said, sounding relieved. "And Mom? Jason's parents will be staying in the guest room, so we were wondering if you'd mind sleeping in the attic room when you stay over for the weekend. We've cleared out some space up there." The attic. Not the cozy guest room with its attached bathroom where I usually stayed, but the unfinished attic, a space used for storage, with a small futon kept there for occasional overflow guests. The room had no proper heating, just a space heater, and the nearest bathroom was down a steep flight of stairs. Of course, if that works best," I heard myself saying, that familiar pattern of accommodation overriding the hurt blossoming in my chest. "You're the best, Mom. Jason's parents are getting older, and the stairs would be difficult for them. I was 67, only 4 years younger than Jason's father, and actually a year older than his mother, but I didn't point this out. I never did." After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the collection of family photos on my refrigerator, Caroline's graduation, Emma's first birthday, Leo's christening. In each one, I stood slightly to the side, present but somehow peripheral. When had that happened? When had I gone from being the center of Caroline's world to an afterthought? That evening, I called my attorney, Rebecca Goldman. We'd worked together at the accounting firm years ago before she left to pursue law. She'd handled my late husband's estate and had been urging me for years to update my will. "It's about time, Helen," she said when I explained my reason for calling. "Can you come in next Wednesday?" As I prepared for Thanksgiving, baking pies and wrapping small gifts for my grandchildren, I thought about the substantial estate I'd built over my lifetime. My husband's life insurance, my diligent savings, smart investments, and the valuable downtown apartment I'd purchased in the 1980s, all of it designated to go to Caroline and her children. I'd never considered any other option, until now. The week before Thanksgiving, I sat in Rebecca's office, discussing possibilities I'd never before entertained. "You have options, Helen," Rebecca said, sliding a legal pad across her desk. "Caroline doesn't have to be the sole beneficiary. There are charitable organizations, educational trusts for the grandchildren that Caroline couldn't access, even friends you might want to provide for. I nodded slowly, thinking of Diane, who'd been my faithful friend for 40 years, always making time for me even when I couldn't reciprocate because of family obligations. And the children's hospital that had treated Caroline's childhood asthma with such compassion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The women's shelter where I volunteered monthly, meeting souls who had never experienced the financial security I'd been fortunate enough to achieve. I want to make some changes, I said finally, but I don't want anyone to know just yet. Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's entirely your right, Helen. Your will is private until you choose to share its contents. As I left her office, a weight I hadn't recognized lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in decades, I'd made a decision centered entirely on my own judgment, not filtered through the lens of what would be best for Caroline. Thanksgiving arrived crisp and clear. I drove to Caroline and Jason's beautiful colonial home, my car loaded with pies, overnight essentials, and carefully wrapped gifts. Caroline greeted me at the door, already looking harried. "Mom, you're early," she said, checking her watch. "We're still getting things organized." "I thought I could help," I offered, following her into the kitchen where Jason's mother, Vivian, was arranging appetizers. "Helen," Vivian acknowledged me with a brief nod, her attention fixed on her elaborate cheese board. "Caroline, is this the arrangement you wanted?" Just like that, I was invisible in the kitchen, a space where, until recently, I had been the authority in Caroline's life. I retreated to the living room, where Emma and Leo spotted me and came running. "Grandma!" Emma threw her arms around my waist. "Did you bring us presents?" "Emma," Caroline admonished, appearing from the kitchen. "That's not polite." "It's okay," I said, reaching into my purse for the small wrapped packages. "Just something small for each of them." Caroline sighed. "Mom, we talked about this. You spoil them too much." I wanted to point out that Caroline had never objected to being spoiled herself. Not when I paid for her college, not when I funded her wedding, not when I provided the down payment for this very house. Instead, I simply handed the gifts to the children and watched their faces light up with joy. "Thanks, Mom," Caroline said, her tone softening slightly. "Let me show you where you'll be staying." I followed her up 2 flights of stairs to the attic door, which opened to reveal exactly what I'd feared. A cluttered space with a sagging futon positioned under the eaves. A small space heater sat in the corner, and a lamp with a crooked shade provided the only light. Caroline had placed clean sheets on the futon and a couple of blankets, but the room was noticeably colder than the rest of the house. "I know it's not ideal," Caroline said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But it's just for 2 nights, and Jason's parents really appreciate having the guest room." "It's fine," I said, setting my overnight bag on the futon. "I'll be comfortable enough." Caroline seemed relieved by my easy acceptance. "Great. Dinner's at 4. Jason's parents like to eat early." After she left, I sat on the edge of the futon, feeling the springs press into my thighs. The space smelled of dust and disuse, with boxes of Christmas decorations and outgrown children's clothes stacked against the walls. Through the small dormer window, I could see the neighborhood, spread out below, comfortable homes filled with families preparing to give thanks. What was I thankful for this year? My grandchildren, certainly. My health, which remained good despite the toll of years. My financial security, hard-earned and carefully maintained. But as I sat in that chilly attic, I wondered about the relationships I'd poured myself into for so long. Had I been nurturing connections or enabling dependencies? Had my generosity fostered gratitude or entitlement? I unpacked my small bag, placing my medications on a dusty side table, arranging my clothes for the next day. As I did, I thought about the appointment with Rebecca, about the changes we'd discussed. For the first time, I felt not guilt but certainty. The path forward was becoming clearer, illuminated not by the dim attic light, but by the dawning recognition of my own worth. That evening, as we gathered around Caroline and Jason's dining table, I observed the dynamics with new awareness. Jason's parents were given the seats of honor at each end of the table. Caroline fluttered around them, refilling glasses, offering more of each dish, laughing too loudly at her father-in-law's tired jokes. Jason beamed with pride as his mother complimented the turkey, which Caroline had prepared following Vivian's explicit instructions. I sat between my grandchildren, helping Leo cut his food, wiping cranberry sauce from Emma's chin. Necessary, practical, but peripheral. When I mentioned the community center where I'd recently started volunteering, teaching financial literacy to young mothers, Caroline looked surprised. "When did you start that, Mom?" she asked, as if the idea of me having activities independent of her family was novel. "About 3 months ago," I replied. "I go every Tuesday afternoon." "But that's when Leo has soccer practice," Caroline said, frowning. "Who's been taking him?" "I have," Jason interjected. "Remember? We talked about this, Caroline. Your mom mentioned her volunteer work, and I said I could handle soccer." Caroline looked momentarily disoriented, as if the pieces of a puzzle had been rearranged without her notice. "Oh, right. I forgot." The conversation moved on, but I caught Jason studying me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Not disapproval exactly, but reassessment. As if he were seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the children put to bed, I excused myself to my attic room. The temperature had dropped further, and the space heater struggled against the November chill. I layered both blankets over me, thinking about the warm guest room below where Jason's parents were comfortably installed. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. "Changes drafted as discussed. Ready for your review next week." I smiled in the darkness, no longer feeling quite so cold. The morning after Thanksgiving dawned with a penetrating chill that the attic's ancient space heater couldn't combat. I woke at 5:30, my joints stiff from the uncomfortable futon, my breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, I lay, perfectly still, listening to the quiet house below me. No voices, no footsteps, just the occasional creak of the old colonial settling in the cold. I wrapped myself in the housecoat I'd packed, slipped my feet into warm slippers, and made my way carefully down the steep, narrow attic stairs. The second floor was silent, Caroline and Jason's bedroom door closed, as was the guest room where his parents slept. I continued down to the first floor, drawn by the promise of warmth and coffee. The kitchen was immaculate, evidence of Caroline's late-night cleaning. I moved through the familiar space quietly, starting the coffee maker, finding my favorite mug in the back of the cabinet where it had been relegated. As the coffee brewed, I gazed out the kitchen window at the frost-covered backyard. The swing set Jason had insisted on buying, even though it was far too advanced for Leo, stood like a silent sentinel over the winter-browned grass. My reflection stared back at me from the window. Silver hair I'd stopped dyeing years ago, lines around my eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, the slight stoop to my shoulders that had developed after decades of bending to others' needs. Who was this woman? I hardly recognized her anymore. The coffee maker gurgled its completion, and I poured myself a full cup, adding just a splash of the cream I found in the refrigerator. Taking my coffee to the small breakfast nook, I pulled out my phone and opened my email. Rebecca had sent the preliminary changes to my will last night, marked confidential. I hesitated before opening it, glancing toward the ceiling as if I could see through the floors to where my family still slept. The document outlined the changes we'd discussed. A trust for Emma and Leo that would fund their education and provide modest annual disbursements once they reached adulthood. But that Caroline and Jason couldn't access. a substantial donation to the Children's Hospital, provisions for Diane, who had been more family to me than anyone since my husband died. And yes, a significantly reduced inheritance for Caroline herself, enough to be comfortable, but not the windfall she had likely been counting on. As I reviewed the document, a strange lightness spread through me. These changes felt right, aligned with my values rather than with the expectation that mothers sacrifice everything for their children, even their own autonomy, even their dignity. "Mom, you're up early." I startled, nearly spilling my coffee, as Caroline appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an expensive cashmere robe, a gift from Jason's parents last Christmas. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion I recognized from my own years of juggling work and single motherhood. "The attic gets cold," I said simply, locking my phone and setting its screen down on the table. "How did you sleep?" Caroline sighed, moving to the coffee maker. "Not great. Leo had a nightmare around 2, and then Emma came in at 4 saying she heard noises. Probably just the house settling. These old colonials make all sorts of sounds, especially in the cold." "Maybe." She poured herself coffee, added a generous amount of cream and sugar, and joined me at the table. For a moment, we sat in silence, an unusual moment of quiet companionship that reminded me of weekend mornings when she was a teenager, before the day's activities pulled us in different directions. "I was thinking," Caroline said finally, cradling her mug, "maybe you could take the kids to the park this morning while I get started on the leftovers for lunch? Jason's parents want to visit his aunt in Providence, and he's going with them." And just like that, the moment was gone, replaced by the familiar pattern of Caroline assuming my availability, my willingness to step in whenever needed. In the past, I would have agreed immediately, grateful for the time with my grandchildren, accepting whatever crumbs of family connection were offered. But something had shifted within me. Perhaps it was the cold night in the attic. Perhaps the email from Rebecca still glowing in my mind. Perhaps simply the accumulation of years of accommodation reaching its limit. "Actually," I said, taking a deliberate sip of my coffee, "I have plans this morning." Caroline looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. "Plans? What plans?" "I'm meeting Diane for breakfast at 9:30. We've had it on the calendar for weeks." This was a small lie. The breakfast with Diane had been tentatively discussed, but never confirmed. But as the words left my mouth, I knew I would make it happen, would reach out to my friend as soon as this conversation ended. "Mom," Caroline began, her tone slipping into the slightly condescending one she'd adopted in recent years. "It's the day after Thanksgiving. Family time. I'm sure Diane would understand if you rescheduled." I met my daughter's gaze steadily. "I've been here since Wednesday afternoon, helping with preparations. I'll be back this afternoon and staying through. Sunday as planned. A 2-hour breakfast with a friend isn't going to derail the holiday weekend." Caroline's expression registered shock, then something like hurt, before settling into a tight smile. "Of course. You've been so helpful. It's just that the kids were really looking forward to time with you, and with Jason gone." The familiar guilt tugged at me, the tool that had been used so effectively for so long to bend me to others' needs. But this time, I didn't bend. "The kids will be fine." "For a couple of hours," I said, rising from the table and rinsing my mug in the sink. "I'll text Diane now to confirm, and then I'll get ready." As I headed back upstairs to the attic, I could feel Caroline's gaze following me, full of confusion and perhaps a dawning realization that something fundamental had changed. The old floorboards creaked under my feet, bearing witness to my small act of rebellion. In the attic, I quickly texted Diane, "Breakfast at Maple Street Cafe at 9:30? Need to catch up." Her response came almost immediately. "Absolutely. Everything okay?" And I smiled at her concern. the way she could sense shifts in my world even through a simple text message. "Getting there," I replied. "See you soon." I dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue sweater that Diane had once complimented and jeans that I knew were flattering. I applied light makeup, brushed my hair into its usual neat bob, and added small pearl earrings, a gift from my late husband on our 20th anniversary. Looking in the small, cloudy mirror I'd propped on a storage box, I saw not just the tired grandmother who descended to the attic the night before, but glimpses of the woman I'd been decades ago, professional, confident, with interests and opinions of my own. When I came back downstairs, Caroline was in the kitchen with the children, pouring cereal into colorful plastic bowls. Emma spotted me first. "Grandma, are you going to take us to the park?" I bent to kiss the top of her head. "Not this morning. Sweetheart, I'm having breakfast with my friend Diane, but I'll be back after lunch and maybe we can play a game together then." Emma's face fell slightly, but she nodded, returning to her cereal. Leo, not yet fully verbal at 2, simply reached for me with sticky hands. I gave him a quick hug, then straightened, meeting Caroline's eyes over the children's heads. "I should be back around noon," I said, keeping my tone light. Caroline nodded stiffly. "We'll be here." As I gathered my purse and coat, I noticed Jason's father, Richard, descending the stairs, already dressed for the day in pressed khakis and a collared shirt. He nodded to me with the distant politeness that had characterized our few interactions over the years. "Good morning, Helen. Off somewhere?" "Breakfast with a friend," I replied, buttoning my coat. He nodded again, then turned his attention to the kitchen where his grandchildren's voices could be heard. I slipped out the front door into the crisp November morning, feeling oddly like a teenager sneaking away from parental restrictions rather than a 67-year-old grandmother taking a perfectly reasonable breakfast with a friend. The freedom of it hit me as I started my car. The simple, profound freedom of making a choice based solely on my own desires, without filtering it through the lens of others' expectations or needs. The sensation was so foreign, so exhilarating, that I actually laughed out loud as I backed out of Caroline's driveway. Maple Street Cafe was a charming spot in the older part of town, with exposed brick walls and mismatched vintage furniture. Diane was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a pot of tea steeping between 2 delicate cups. She stood to embrace me, her familiar scent of lavender and Earl Grey tea washing over me. "Helen," she said, pulling back, to study my face. "You look different." I smiled, settling into the chair across from her. "Different good or different bad?" "Different awake," she replied, her keen eyes still assessing me. "Like you've finally emerged from a very long nap." Diane had always had this ability to see beyond my carefully constructed facades. We'd met at the accounting firm 30 years ago, 2 women navigating a predominantly male profession, supporting each other through divorces, hers, widowhood, mine, child-rearing challenges, and career transitions. Where my relationship with Caroline had gradually eroded into a one-sided giving arrangement, my friendship with Diane had maintained its balance: reciprocal support, honest communication, genuine interest in each other's lives. "Maybe I have," I said, pouring tea for both of us. "Did you know that Caroline made me sleep in the attic last night?" Diane's eyebrows shot up. "The attic? Not the guest room?" "The guest room was for Jason's parents." I stirred a small spoonful of honey into my tea. The attic had a futon and a space heater that barely worked. I woke up this morning and could see my breath. "Helen," Diane said, her voice a mixture of shock and something like vindication. That's unacceptable. You're her mother." "For heaven's sake, and you're not exactly 25 anymore." I laughed softly. "Neither are Jason's parents. His father is 71, his mother 66. I'm 67. But apparently I'm the one expected to climb 2 flights of narrow stairs to sleep in an unheated space. And you went along with it? Of course you did. Diane shook her head. You've always gone along with whatever Caroline wants. The gentle criticism stung, but only because it was true. I did, I admitted. But something changed, Diane. Sleeping up there, feeling so peripheral to my own family, I finally saw things clearly. I've been enabling Caroline to treat me as an accessory in her life, not as a person with my own needs and dignity. Diane reached across the table to squeeze my hand. It's about time, my friend. The waitress arrived then to take our orders. Diane chose her usual vegetable omelet, while I opted for Belgian waffles with fresh berries, a small indulgence I rarely allowed myself. I've been meeting with Rebecca Goldman, I continued once the waitress had gone. About my will. Diane's eyes widened slightly. The will that leaves everything to Caroline and the grandchildren? I nodded. I'm making changes. Significant ones. For the next half hour, over steaming tea and eventually our breakfast plates, I outlined the modifications Rebecca was drafting. Diane listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to approval. The trust for the grandchildren is brilliant, she said, spearing a piece of omelet. They'll get the support they need without Jason and Caroline having access. That's the idea, I agreed, savoring the sweet tart burst of berries against the crisp waffle. I love my grandchildren, and I want to ensure they have opportunities. But I've watched how Caroline and Jason handle money. The expensive renovations, the luxury vacations, the constant upgrading of perfectly good furniture and appliances. I don't want my life savings to vanish into those kinds of expenditures. And the provision for me? Diane asked softly. Helen, that's unnecessary. I'm comfortable. It's not about need, I replied firmly. It's about recognition. You've been more family to me than almost anyone since David died. Why shouldn't my estate reflect that? Diane's eyes grew suspiciously bright. She blinked rapidly, then raised her teacup in a small toast. To recognition, then. And to you, Helen, finally recognizing your own worth. We finished our breakfast, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Diane's recent pottery class, a movie we both wanted to see, her son's new job in Seattle. By the time we paid the bill and stepped back onto the sunlit street, I felt more myself than I had in years. What will you do now? Diane asked as we lingered by our cars. Caroline is expecting you back? Not until noon, I said, checking my watch. It was just past 11. I think I'll take a little drive, maybe stop by that bookstore we like. Diane studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. Take your time. And Helen? Call me anytime this weekend if you need to escape again. My guest room, my actual heated, comfortable guest room, is always available to you. I hugged her tightly, grateful beyond words for her unwavering support. As I watched her drive away, I felt a momentary pang of anxiety about returning to Caroline's house, to the dynamics that had defined our relationship for so long. But beneath that anxiety was something stronger, a determination to continue. This awakening, to stand in my truth even when it created discomfort. The bookstore was quiet on the Friday morning after Thanksgiving, most shoppers either still at home with family or battling crowds at the mall's Black Friday sales. I wandered, the aisles aimlessly at first, running my fingers over spines, breathing in the comforting scent of paper and possibility. In the travel section, I found myself lingering, pulling out guidebooks for places I'd always wanted to visit but had never prioritized. The lavender fields of Provence, the ancient streets of Kyoto, the wild coasts of Ireland. On impulse, I selected the guide to Provence, carrying it to the register where a young woman with bright blue hair smiled at me. Just this today? She asked, scanning the barcode. Yes, thank you, I replied, then hesitated. Actually, do you have any books on women traveling solo, particularly older women? The clerk's smile widened. We do. There's been a whole wave of them recently. Follow me. She led me to a display I'd overlooked, featuring titles like 60 and Solo, A Woman's Journey Around the World, and It's Never Too Late, Finding Yourself Through Travel After 50. I selected two that spoke to me most, returning to the register with a lighter step. Planning an adventure? The clerk asked as she rang up my expanded selection. I think I might be, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. As I drove back to Caroline's house, the book sat on the passenger seat beside me, tangible symbols of the shift occurring within me. I wasn't just changing my will, I was changing my life's direction, reclaiming the autonomy I'd surrendered years ago in the name of maternal duty. Caroline's house came into view, its colonial charm undeniable. The symmetrical windows, the tasteful wreath still hanging from Thanksgiving, the immaculate yard that Jason paid a service to maintain. I pulled into the driveway behind Caroline's SUV, noting that Jason's car was still gone. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my purchases and my resolve, then headed for the front door. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the distant sound of the television from the family room. I followed the noise to find Caroline on the couch, scrolling through her phone while the children watched an animated movie, both still in their pajamas despite the late morning hour. I'm back, I announced from the doorway. 3 heads turned in my direction. Emma jumped up immediately, running to hug my legs. Grandma, we missed you. I bent to return her embrace, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. I missed you too, sweetheart. Have you had lunch yet? Mom said we had to wait for you, Emma reported, glancing back at Caroline, who had set down her phone and was straightening her sweater. I thought we could all eat together, Caroline said, her tone carefully neutral. There are plenty of leftovers. That sounds lovely, I replied, matching her polite tone. Should I help warm things up? Sure, Caroline rose from the couch. Kids, 5 more minutes of the movie, then wash hands for lunch. In the kitchen, Caroline moved efficiently, pulling containers from the refrigerator while I found plates in the cabinet. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the familiar dance of meal preparation creating an illusion of normalcy. How was breakfast? Caroline finally asked, her back to me as she transferred turkey and stuffing to a microwave-safe dish. Wonderful, I said honestly. It was good to catch up with Diane. She's thinking about taking a pottery class if I want to join her. Pottery? Caroline turned, a small frown creasing her forehead. Since when are you interested in pottery? I shrugged, arranging rolls in a basket. I'm not sure that I am, but it might be fun to try. Diane says it's very meditative. Caroline's frown deepened. But what about watching the kids on Tuesdays? You know that's when I have my committee meetings. And there it was. The assumption that my time was perpetually available, that my interests and activities were secondary to her needs. In the past, I would have immediately reassured her, promised to work the pottery class around her schedule, or simply abandoned the idea altogether. Instead, I said, the class is on Thursday evenings, but Caroline, even if it were on Tuesdays, we would need to work something out. I can't always be available for childcare. She stared at me as if I'd suggested something outrageous. Mom, you've always watched the kids on Tuesdays. It's our arrangement. An arrangement implies mutual agreement and benefit, I replied, keeping my voice gentle but firm. I love spending time with Emma and Leo, but I also need space for my own interests and relationships. The microwave beeped, breaking the tension momentarily as Caroline turned to retrieve the heated food. When she spoke again, her voice had that slight edge I recognized as suppressed frustration. I don't understand what's gotten into you, Mom. First the breakfast when you knew we needed help with the kids, now this talk about pottery classes, and your own interests. Is this because of the attic room? Because I already explained why that was necessary. I set the roll basket on the kitchen island, considering my words carefully. This was new territory for both of us, me setting boundaries, Caroline encountering them for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. It's not about the attic specifically, I said finally. Though I admit, sleeping there did give me time to think. Caroline, I'm 67 years old. I've dedicated my life to supporting you, emotionally, practically, financially. I've never begrudged any of it because I love you. But somewhere along the way, I think we both forgot that. I'm a person in my own right, not just your mother, not just Emma and Leo's grandmother. Caroline's expression shifted from frustration to something more complex. Confusion, defensive anger, perhaps a flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed. So what are you saying? That you don't want to be involved with us anymore? That your grandchildren are suddenly a burden? That's not what I'm saying at all, I replied, feeling a familiar weariness creep in. This tendency to cast things in extreme terms, to interpret any boundary setting as complete rejection, was so typical of our dynamic. I'm saying that I need balance. I need to be treated with the same consideration you'd show to any other important person in your life. Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of small feet pounding down the hallway. Emma and Leo burst into the kitchen, faces washed, hands presumably clean. Lunchtime, Emma announced, climbing onto her usual chair. I want turkey and mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. The moment for deeper conversation had passed, replaced by the immediate demands of hungry children. Caroline and I completed the meal preparations in silence, served the food, sat down to eat. The children's chatter filled the space between us, creating a buffer that was both welcome and somehow sad, evidence of how difficult direct communication had become. As I helped Leo navigate his fork, responding to Emma's detailed description of the movie they'd been watching, I noticed Caroline watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Wariness, perhaps. Calculation. The look of someone reassessing, a situation they had believed they understood completely. After lunch, as I loaded the dishwasher while Caroline wiped down the table, my phone chimed with a text message. I dried my hands on a dish towel and checked the screen. It was from Rebecca. Changes to will drafted as discussed. Available to review final document next Tuesday at 10 a.m. if that works for you. I felt Caroline's eyes on me as I typed my reply. Tuesday at 10 is perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Work stuff? Caroline asked, her tone casual but her attention focused. Just confirming an appointment, I replied, slipping the phone back into my pocket. An appointment? Caroline echoed. With who? The old impulse to simply answer, to maintain the transparency that had characterized our relationship for so long, was strong. But something held me back. A new understanding that not every detail of my life needed to be available for Caroline's inspection and approval. Just some personal business I need to take care of, I said, turning back to the dishes. Personal business, Caroline repeated slowly. What kind of personal business requires appointments? I closed the dishwasher, pressed the start button and turned to face my daughter. Caroline, I love you, but not everything in my life requires your knowledge or approval. This is something I'm handling on my own. The shock on her face would have been comical if it weren't so revealing of our dysfunctional patterns. The idea that I might have aspects of my life that were private, that I might make decisions without her input or even awareness, seemed to genuinely destabilize her. Mom? She began, her voice tight with controlled emotion. I'm just concerned about you. You're acting so different. The breakfast with Diane, these mysterious appointments, talking about pottery classes and your own interests. It's not like you. Maybe it should be, I said quietly. Maybe it's time for both of us to get to know who I am beyond being your mother. Before she could respond, the sound of the front door opening announced Jason's return. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression brightening when he spotted me. Helen! You're back! The kids behaved themselves this morning. I wasn't here, I replied. I had breakfast with my friend Diane. Something flickered in Jason's eyes, surprise, but also something else. Respect, perhaps? Good for you, he said, reaching into the refrigerator for a bottle of water. Everyone needs friend time, especially during family holidays when it gets intense. I caught Caroline's gaze over Jason's shoulder, saw the flash of betrayal in her eyes at her husband's, casual approval of what she clearly viewed as my defection. But before either of us could speak, Emma came running in, launching herself at her father. Daddy, you're home. Did you bring me anything? The moment passed, submerged beneath the tide of family life, resuming its normal rhythms. But as I excused myself to rest for a bit before dinner, claiming fatigue from the poor night's sleep in the attic, I knew that something had fundamentally shifted. The change within me was beginning to manifest in the world around me, creating ripples that would eventually reach every shore of my existence. In the attic room, I sat on the edge of the futon, removed the travel books from their bag, and ran my fingers over the glossy covers. Lavender fields stretching to the horizon, ancient stone villages perched on hillsides, markets bursting with color and life. Places where no one knew me as Caroline's mother or Emma and Leo's grandmother. Places where I could simply be Helen Parker, traveler, observer, woman in her own right. I opened the Provence guidebook to a random page and began to read about a small village known for its exceptional pottery tradition, where visitors could take workshops with local artisans. The synchronicity made me smile. Pottery seemed to be appearing in my life from multiple directions, a gentle nudge toward creative expression I'd never allowed myself to explore. As the afternoon light slanted through the small attic window, casting long shadows across the cluttered space, I felt a sense of possibility expanding within me. The discomfort of the attic, initially a source of hurt and resentment, had become the catalyst for a profound awakening. In this neglected space, pushed to the margins of the family home, I had found the perspective needed to reclaim the center of my own life. I heard footsteps on the stairs, then a soft knock at the attic door. Mom? Caroline's voice, hesitant. Dinner will be ready in about half an hour. Jason's parents are back. Thank you, I called. I'll be down soon. Her footsteps retreated, and I returned to my guidebook, to dreams of lavender and pottery, and a self I was only just beginning to discover. The journey ahead would not be simple or straightforward. Decades of established patterns couldn't be transformed overnight. But I had taken the first step, the most important one, recognizing that the path I'd been walking was no longer taking me where I needed to go. And somewhere deep within me, a long dormant spark of joy ignited at the thought of charting a new course, one that honored both my love for my family and my duty to myself. The remainder of the Thanksgiving weekend passed in a curious dance of old patterns and new boundaries. I continued to help with meals, to play with Emma and Leo, to engage in polite conversation with Jason's parents. But I also took a long walk, alone on Saturday afternoon, browsed a small art gallery in town, and spent Sunday morning reading my travel books while the family attended church, something I'd quietly opted out of despite Caroline's obvious disapproval. Mom never misses church, she'd explained to Vivian, who had raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow in my direction. I'm feeling a bit under the weather, I'd replied smoothly. Probably that cold attic air. Jason had coughed to cover what might have been a laugh, earning a sharp look from Caroline. The dynamic between us was shifting in subtle ways, with Jason seeming almost amused by my small acts of independence, while Caroline grew increasingly anxious, watching me with the wariness of someone who senses a storm approaching but can't determine from which direction. By Sunday evening, when I packed my overnight bag and prepared to return to my apartment, there was a palpable tension between us. Caroline hovered as I gathered my things from the attic, her questions about when I'd next visit the children carrying an undertone of accusation. I'll call you this week, I said, embracing her stiffly. We'll figure out a schedule that works for everyone. Her arms remained at her sides for a moment before reluctantly returning my hug. The kids are used to seeing you every Tuesday and Thursday, Mom. They need consistency. I stepped back, meeting her gaze directly. They'll adapt, Caroline. Children are resilient. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the radio playing. Soft jazz as I processed the weekend's events. The discomfort of confrontation warred with the exhilaration of setting boundaries, creating a strange emotional cocktail of guilt, liberation, and anticipation. By the time I unlocked my apartment door, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, ready to collapse into bed but also to begin planning my next steps. The apartment welcomed me with its familiar comfort. The soft gray sofa where I spent evenings reading, the kitchen with its cheerful yellow curtains, the bedroom I'd redecorated last year with a splurge on high-quality linens that had felt almost scandalously self-indulgent at the time. This space was mine, arranged according to my preferences, a sanctuary I realized I'd been treating more like a way station between visits to Caroline's family. Monday morning found me at my small dining table, notebook open, making lists. The appointment with Rebecca was scheduled for the following day to finalize the will changes. Beyond that, I had decisions to make about the pottery class with Diane, about my childcare commitments to Caroline, and most intriguingly, about travel. The guidebooks I'd purchased had awakened something in me, a long-dormant desire to see more of the world than the limited trips I'd taken over the years. My late husband and I had always planned to travel extensively after retirement, but his illness had intervened, and after his death, my focus had shifted entirely to supporting Caroline and her family. Now, approaching 70, I wondered what was stopping me. My health was good, my financial situation stable thanks to careful planning. The grandchildren were young, but they wouldn't suffer from my occasional absence. Perhaps it was time to dust off those old dreams, to consider what might still be possible. I opened my laptop and began researching, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. A cooking course in Provence, a pottery retreat in the hills of Tuscany, a 2-week walking tour of the gardens of England. The possibilities multiplied on my screen, each one more appealing than the last. By noon, I'd created a document titled Possible Adventures 2025, listing options by season, duration, and cost. The exercise felt both frivolous and profound, mapping potential futures based solely on my own interests and desires, without filtering them through the needs of others. My phone rang, Caroline's name flashing on the screen. I hesitated before answering, closing my laptop as if she might somehow see the travel research through the phone connection. "Hello, Caroline." "Hi, Mom." Her voice was tight, controlled. "Just checking that you got home safely last night. You didn't call." The implied criticism was familiar. I'd always called immediately upon arriving home from anywhere, part of our established pattern of Caroline monitoring my movements under the guise of concern. "I got home fine," I replied. "I was tired and went straight to bed." A pause, then, "Well, I was worried. You normally call." "I'm sorry you were worried," I said, not quite an apology. "I'm perfectly fine." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, what's going on with you? Ever since Thanksgiving, you've been different." I took a deep breath, considering my response. The easy path would be reassurance, a return to the familiar dance. But something inside me resisted. "I've been doing some thinking, Caroline, about my life, my choices, what I want for my remaining years." "Your remaining years?" Her voice rose slightly. "You make it sound like you're on your deathbed. You're only 67. "Exactly," I said. "I'm 67, not 47. I don't have unlimited time left, and I'm starting to ask myself how I want to spend it." "And the answer isn't with your family? With your grandchildren who adore you?" The guilt trip was so predictable I almost smiled. Of course I want to. Spend time with all of you, but not exclusively. I have other interests I'd like to pursue. Like pottery classes? Her tone made it sound as ridiculous as joining the circus. Like pottery, yes, and perhaps some travel. Travel? Now she sounded genuinely alarmed. Where? With whom? For how long? I felt a flash of irritation at the interrogation. I don't know yet, Caroline. I'm exploring options. When I have concrete plans, I'll share them with you. But what about the kids? What about our routine? Mom, they count on you. I count on you. And there it was, the crux of the matter. Caroline had built her life around my reliability, my constant availability. Any deviation threatened the carefully constructed system that allowed her and Jason to maintain their busy careers and social lives while having built-in, cost-free childcare and household support. Caroline, I said gently, I love you and the children more than anything, but I need to find a better balance. I'll always be there for important things, but I can't continue to be available at a moment's notice for whatever you need. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. When Caroline finally spoke, her voice was cold. I see. Well, I should go. I have a meeting. Let me know when you've decided how much of your precious time you can spare for us. The call ended before I could respond. I set the phone down on the table, feeling the familiar ache of conflict with my only child. But beneath that ache was something else. A quiet certainty that I was on the right path, despite the discomfort it created. The next morning, I dressed with particular care for my appointment with Rebecca, a charcoal gray pantsuit I'd purchased years ago for client. Meetings at the accounting firm, now rarely worn but still elegant and well-fitting. Pearl earrings, a touch of makeup, hair freshly washed and styled. Looking in the mirror, I saw not just a grandmother, but a professional woman, a financially independent individual making considered decisions about her estate. Rebecca's Law office occupied the top floor of a renovated historic building downtown. The receptionist, a young man with a friendly smile, showed me to a comfortable seating area while alerting Rebecca to my arrival. Minutes later, Rebecca herself appeared, elegant in a navy suit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Helen, she greeted me warmly, extending her hand. Right on time, as always. Let's go to my office. I followed her. Through the reception area to a corner office with large windows overlooking the town square. Unlike many lawyers' offices with their imposing dark furniture and walls of leather-bound books, Rebecca's space was modern and inviting. Pale wood desk, comfortable chairs, shelves displaying family photos alongside legal texts. How was your Thanksgiving? She asked as we settled into our seats. Illuminating, I replied with a small smile. I spent it in Caroline's attic. Rebecca's eyebrows rose. The attic? Not the guest room? The guest room was reserved for Jason's parents. I see. Her tone conveyed perfect understanding of what wasn't being said. And how did that make you feel? I considered the question, appreciating that Rebecca was treating this as more than just a legal transaction. Initially, hurt, angry, but ultimately grateful. Grateful? Now she looked surprised. It was the wake-up call I needed, I explained. Sleeping in that cold attic, relegated to the periphery of family life, I could suddenly see with perfect clarity how I've allowed myself to be treated, not just by Caroline, but by myself. Rebecca nodded slowly. Sometimes we need those moments of discomfort to recognize patterns we've been living with for too long. Exactly. I straightened in my chair, ready to move forward. So the will changes. Is everything prepared as we discussed? Rebecca opened a folder on her desk. It is. I've drawn up the trust for Emma and Leo as specified, with the educational provisions and the age restrictions on access to the principal. The Bequests to the Children's Hospital and Women's Shelter are structured as we discussed. And of course, the provision for Diane. And Caroline's portion? Reduced to 25% of the estate, as you requested. Rebecca looked up from the papers. Are you comfortable with that figure? It's a significant reduction from the original. I nodded firmly. I am. 25% is still a substantial inheritance. Combined with what Jason earns and their existing assets, Caroline will be more than comfortable. The rest should go where it can do the most good, to the grandchildren's future, to organizations doing important work, and to Diane, who has been family to me in all the ways that matter. Rebecca studied me for a moment, then smiled. You've given this a lot of thought. I can see you're at peace with the decision. I am, I confirmed. More than I expected to be, honestly. It feels like reclaiming something essential. The right to determine where the fruits of my life's work should go. We spent the next hour reviewing the documents in detail, Rebecca explaining each clause and provision with the precision I'd always appreciated in her legal work. When she finally slid the papers across for my signature, I felt none of the hesitation I'd anticipated, only a calm certainty that I was acting in alignment with my values. So that's it? I asked after signing the final page. The will is updated? That's it, Rebecca confirmed, gathering the papers. I'll file these today. You'll receive an official copy for your records by the end of the week. She hesitated, then added, Helen, have you considered talking to Caroline about these changes? I shook my head. Not yet. I need to establish my own footing first, to be clear in my mind and heart about the choices I'm making. If I tell her now, the conversation will become about her feelings of entitlement rather than my right to make these decisions. Fair enough, Rebecca said. But at some point, that conversation may be important. Not for Caroline's sake necessarily, but for yours. For the relationship. I nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. I know, and I will talk to her when the time is right. But first, I need to live into this new understanding of myself, to prove to myself that I can maintain these boundaries even when it's difficult. As I left Rebecca's office, stepping out into the crisp December air, I felt lighter somehow, as if signing those documents had released a weight I'd been carrying for years. The weight of obligation disconnected from reciprocity, of giving without boundaries, of placing Caroline's needs and wants above my own in every circumstance. I checked my watch, just past noon. On impulse, I called Diane. Are you free for lunch? I asked when she answered. I've just finished at Rebecca's office and I'm feeling rather celebratory. Give me 20 minutes, Diane replied without hesitation. Trentini's on Main Street? Perfect. See you there. Trentini's was a small Italian restaurant we'd discovered years ago, with exceptional pasta and a quiet atmosphere that allowed for real conversation. As I waited for Diane, I sipped a glass of Pinot Grigio, another small act of independence, as I rarely drank alcohol during the day. Diane arrived promptly, unwinding a colorful scarf as she made her way to my table. You look positively radiant, she observed, settling into her chair. I take it the will signing went well? It did, I confirmed, raising my wine glass in a small toast. To new beginnings. Diane clinked her water glass against mine. To new beginnings, indeed. Tell me everything. Over caprese salad and linguine with clams, I recounted the meeting with Rebecca, the decisions we'd finalized, the sense of empowerment I'd felt signing the documents. What's next? Diane asked as we lingered over espresso. Now that you've made these changes, where do you go from here? I smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement. I'm thinking about a trip. Nothing too ambitious to start. Perhaps a week in Provence next spring. There's a cooking course in a small village outside Avignon that looks wonderful. Helen Parker, international culinary student, Diane said with an approving nod. I love it. Solo travel? I think so, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I've never traveled alone before, but there's something appealing about the freedom of it. Setting my own pace, following my interests without compromise. It's liberating, Diane agreed. I've done several solo trips since my divorce, and there's nothing quite like waking up in a new place with no agenda but your own curiosity. She paused, stirring her espresso thoughtfully. What about the pottery class? Still interested? Absolutely. When does it start? Next Thursday, 7 to 9 at the Community Arts Center, 6-week session. I smiled, already imagining the feel of clay beneath my fingers, the challenge of learning something entirely new. Count me in. Diane's face lit up. Wonderful. I'll email you the registration link. She hesitated, then added more softly, How are things with Caroline? My smile faded slightly. Tense. She knows something's changing, and she doesn't like it. We had a difficult conversation yesterday. She doesn't understand why I suddenly want me time after all these years of being completely available to her. Of course she doesn't, Diane said with a gentle snort. You've spent decades training her to expect your total devotion. It's going to take time for both of you to adjust to a new normal. I know, I sighed. I'm trying to be patient, to understand that this is difficult for her too. But I can't go back to the way things were, Diane. I just can't. Nor should you. Diane reached across the table to squeeze my hand. This journey you're on, it's not selfish, Helen. It's necessary. Not just for you, but for Caroline too, though she doesn't see it yet. No healthy relationship can survive when one person consistently subordinates their needs to the others. I nodded, grateful as always for Diane's clarity and support. As we walked out of the restaurant together, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The will changes were just the beginning, a concrete step toward reclaiming my autonomy, but only the first of many I would need to take. December unfolded with quiet determination. I registered for the pottery class with Diane, booked the cooking course in Provence for the following May, and began gradually reshaping my commitments to Caroline and the grandchildren. Instead of the open-ended availability I'd provided in the past, I established clear days and times when I could help with childcare, Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, with occasional flexibility for special circumstances. Caroline's response oscillated between icy resignation and emotional manipulation. Emma asked why Grandma doesn't love her anymore, she reported during one particularly difficult phone call, her voice trembling with what might have been real tears or calculated affect. Caroline, I replied evenly, we both know that's not true. I spent all of Saturday morning with Emma, baking Christmas cookies and reading her new book. She knows perfectly well that I love her. Well, she's confused by your absence. We all are. I'm not absent, I pointed out. I'm simply not available around the clock anymore. There's a difference. My first pottery class with Diane was a revelation. The Community Arts Center bustled with activity. Adults of all ages gathered in various studios for painting, sculpture, photography, and our ceramics class. Our instructor, Marta, a woman perhaps 10 years my junior with strong hands and an infectious enthusiasm, guided us through the basics of working with clay. My first attempts were laughably clumsy. The bowl I tried to form collapsed into itself. The cup ended up with walls so thick it would have weighed a pound when fired. But the sensation of the cool, responsive clay between my fingers, the meditative quality of the wheel spinning, the companionable concentration of the others in the class, it all created a space of pure presence, unlike anything I'd experienced in years. This is harder than it looks, I laughed to Diane as we washed clay from our hands after class. But wonderful, isn't it? She replied, her eyes bright. I haven't been this absorbed in something new in ages. As Christmas approached, the tension with Caroline intensified. Holiday traditions had always been my domain, the decorating. the baking, the careful selection of gifts for everyone. This year, I suggested a modified approach. I thought we could do Christmas Eve at my apartment, just a simple dinner before you all head to midnight mass, I proposed during a visit to their home. Then, Christmas Day can be at your house, as usual. Caroline stared at me as if I'd suggested canceling Christmas altogether. But Mom, we always do both days at our house. The kids wake up Christmas morning and run to find their stockings. Then we have your special cinnamon rolls for breakfast. It's tradition. Traditions can evolve, I said gently. I'm not suggesting we abandon everything, just adjust a bit. I can still make the cinnamon rolls and bring them over Christmas morning. Caroline's expression hardened. This is about your me time again, isn't it? Christmas Eve used to be your favorite part of the holidays. Cooking all day, making everything. Special for us. Now, suddenly it's too much effort? It's not about effort, I tried to explain. It's about balance. About creating a holiday that works for everyone, including me. I don't understand what's happened to you, Caroline said, her voice rising. Ever since Thanksgiving, it's like you've turned into a different person. My mother would never have— I am your mother, I interrupted, feeling a rare flash of real anger. I've always been your mother, Caroline, but I'm also Helen, a person with needs and desires of my own. I've spent decades putting those aside to focus entirely on you and your family. I'm not doing that anymore. Caroline's face flushed. So now we're a burden? After everything— Stop. My voice was quiet but firm. I've never said or implied that you or the children are a burden. I love you all deeply, but love doesn't require self-erasure. Emma appeared in the doorway, then saving us from further escalation. Grandma, will you read me a story, please? I welcomed the interruption, following my granddaughter to her room where she'd already selected a book from her shelf. As I sat on the edge of her bed, Emma climbed into my lap with the comfortable familiarity of a child who knows she is loved. Why is Mommy yelling? She asked as I opened the book. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about things, sweetheart. Your mom and I are working through a disagreement right now. Emma considered this solemnly. Is it because you don't come over as much anymore? Partly, I admitted. I'm trying to find a balance between spending time with you and your brother, which I love very much, and also doing some other things that are important to me. Like your pottery class? Mommy said you're playing with mud like a little kid. I stifled a flash of irritation at Caroline's characterization. It's not exactly playing with mud, though it is fun. It's learning to make beautiful things out of clay, bowls, cups, vases. Maybe I could take you to a children's pottery class sometime. Would you like that? Emma nodded enthusiastically. Just me? Not Leo? Maybe just you, for a special grandmother-granddaughter day. She beamed, snuggling closer. I'd like that. As I read her the story, a tale about a little girl who discovers a magical garden, I reflected on the complexity of what I was trying to navigate. It wasn't as simple as asserting independence versus maintaining family connections. The real challenge was redefining those connections on more equitable terms, showing Caroline through example rather than argument what healthy boundaries looked like, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrating to Emma a model of womanhood that included self-respect alongside familial love. The Christmas compromise eventually reached was imperfect but workable. Christmas Eve would be at my apartment, but limited to dinner and gift exchange before they left for church. Christmas Day would proceed as tradition dictated at their home, with my cinnamon rolls and the elaborate gift unwrapping that the children anticipated all year. I threw myself into preparations for Christmas Eve, but with a difference. Instead of the exhausting multi-course meal I'd always prepared in the past, I opted for a simpler menu: a beautiful beef tenderloin, roasted vegetables, a salad with winter fruits, and a bûche de Noël from the excellent French bakery downtown. I decorated thoughtfully, but not excessively, creating a warm, festive atmosphere without the weeks of effort I'd expended in previous years. The day before Christmas Eve, Diane helped me set the table, arranging the good china I rarely used and placing the hand-dipped beeswax candles I'd found at a local artisan market. "It looks lovely," she said, stepping back to admire our work. "Elegant, but not ostentatious. Very you." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a flutter of nervous anticipation. "I hope Caroline can see that different doesn't mean worse." Diane squeezed my shoulder. "Even if she can't see it yet, you're setting an important example. Holidays don't have to be exercises in maternal martyrdom to be meaningful." When Caroline, Jason, and the children arrived the following evening, I greeted them at the door with genuine warmth, determined to make the evening a success despite the underlying tension. Emma immediately ran to hug me, while Leo toddled behind, clutching a small stuffed reindeer. Jason carried a bottle of wine and a bouquet of winter flowers, his smile easy and unforced. "Merry Christmas, Helen," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "The place looks beautiful." Caroline followed more slowly, her expression cautious as she took in the decorations, the set table visible through the dining room doorway, the subtle holiday music playing in the background. "Everything looks nice," she offered, her tone suggesting surprise. "Thank you," I replied simply, accepting her coat. "I'm so glad you all could come. Dinner will be ready in about half an hour, but there's cheese and crackers in the living room to tide us over." The evening progressed with a delicate balance of old and new. We maintained some beloved traditions, reading The Night Before Christmas to the children, placing a special ornament on my small tree, singing carols as Jason played simple accompaniment on his phone. But the atmosphere was different, more relaxed, less performative. I wasn't constantly jumping up to check on food or refill drinks or ensure everyone's perfect comfort. I was present, engaged, enjoying the company rather than orchestrating the experience. The meal itself was a success, the tenderloin perfectly cooked, the vegetables caramelized and fragrant, the bûche de Noël a beautiful conclusion that had earned appreciative murmurs from everyone, even Caroline. "This was really lovely, Mom," she said as they prepared to leave for church, her voice holding a note of genuine warmth for the first time in weeks. Different, but good different. I hugged her, feeling a small thaw in the ice between us. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me." After they'd gone, I moved through my apartment slowly, tidying but not exhausting myself with immediate full cleanup. I poured a small glass of the excellent wine Jason had brought and settled onto my sofa, gazing at the tree lights in the darkness. This, I realized, was what I'd been seeking. Not a severing of family ties, but a rebalancing. A way to be fully present in my role as mother and grandmother, while also honoring my needs as an individual. The path forward wouldn't be smooth or straight. Decades of established patterns couldn't be reshaped overnight. But I had taken the first crucial steps, and with each one, the next became clearer. My phone chimed with a notification. An email from the travel company confirming my deposit for the Provence cooking course. I smiled, imagining the sun-drenched kitchen where I would learn to make bouillabaisse and ratatouille, the lavender, fields I would walk through, the ancient villages I would explore, a future opening before me, vast with possibility. Christmas Day at Caroline's unfolded with its usual festive chaos, excited children tearing into wrapped packages, Christmas music playing, the living room gradually disappearing under drifts of discarded wrapping paper. I arrived early with the promised cinnamon rolls, still warm from the oven, and a bag of additional gifts. Caroline met me at the door in her robe, coffee cup in hand, looking tired, but happy. "Merry Christmas, Mom." "The kids have been up since 5 asking when you'd get here." "Merry Christmas," I replied, balancing the rolls and gifts as I stepped inside. I've brought reinforcements in the form of sugar and cinnamon. The morning passed pleasantly, with Emma and Leo exclaiming over their new toys, Jason documenting everything with his camera, and Caroline gradually relaxing as she saw that despite our recent tensions, I was fully present for this important day. When the gift-opening frenzy subsided, Caroline disappeared into the kitchen to begin preparations for Christmas dinner. I followed, finding her organizing ingredients on the counter. "Need help?" I offered, tying on the apron I kept at their house. She glanced up, a small smile playing at her lips. "Always. But you don't have to. It's your Christmas, too." The olive branch was slight, but unmistakable. I moved beside her, washing my hands at the sink. "I want to. Some traditions are worth keeping exactly as they are." We worked together in comfortable silence for a while, falling into the familiar rhythm of shared cooking that had been part of our relationship since Caroline was tall enough to reach the counter. As I chopped onions for the stuffing, I sensed her watching me. "Mom?" she said finally, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said, about balance and boundaries and all of it." I looked up, waiting. "I still don't fully understand what's happening with you," she continued, measuring broth into a measuring cup with careful precision. "This sudden need for me time and pottery classes and travel. But I've been trying to step back and look at things from your perspective, and I realized something." "What's that?" I asked gently. "You've never asked for anything for yourself. Not really. Not in all the time I can remember." She set down the measuring cup, meeting my gaze directly. "And that's not normal, is it? That's not healthy." The simple recognition, however tentative, brought an unexpected lump to my throat. "No," I agreed softly. "It's not." Caroline nodded slowly. "I'm trying, Mom, to understand, to adjust. It's just, you've always been my rock. The one constant I could absolutely count on no matter what. The idea that you might not be available whenever I need you is scary." "I'm still your rock," I assured her, setting down my knife to touch her arm. "That hasn't changed. I still love you more than anything in this world. I'm just trying to find a way to love myself too, to honor my own needs alongside yours and the children's. I get that, intellectually at least." She attempted a smile. "Emotionally, I'm still working on it." "That's all I can ask," I said. "That we both keep working on it, keep talking, keep trying to understand each other." The moment was interrupted by Leo toddling into the kitchen, proudly clutching a new toy train. But something had shifted between us, a small opening, a glimmer of mutual understanding that felt like the beginning of healing. Later that afternoon, as the family gathered around the Christmas table, I looked at the faces of those I loved most in the world. Caroline, animated as she described a work project to Jason's parents. Jason carving the turkey with careful attention. Emma trying to sit primly in her special Christmas dress. Leo more interested in playing with his peas than eating them. My family, my heart. And yet, for perhaps the first time, I could feel the contours of myself distinct from them. Helen Parker, not just Caroline's mother or Emma and Leo's grandmother, but a woman with her own dreams, her own path to follow. The knowledge settled in me like a benediction, a quiet certainty that the journey I had begun on that cold night in the attic was not just necessary, but right, for all of us. Winter melted into spring, bringing with it not just warmer temperatures and budding trees, but a gradual new rhythm to my life. The pottery class with Diane had ended with modest success. My final pieces were wobbly but recognizable as bowls and mugs, glazed in soft blues that reminded me of the ocean. I displayed them proudly on a shelf in my living room, tangible evidence of my journey toward self-reclamation. My relationship with Caroline remained complex but evolving. The Christmas Day breakthrough had been real but fragile, like the first. Tender shoots after a harsh winter. There were still difficult moments, tense phone calls when I couldn't accommodate last-minute babysitting requests, strained silences when I mentioned my upcoming trip to Provence. But there were also signs of growth. Caroline occasionally asking about my pottery progress, Emma excitedly planning our special grandmother-granddaughter day at the children's pottery studio, even Jason sending me links to cooking schools in France he thought I might enjoy. As April arrived, my departure for Provence grew closer, creating both excitement and anxiety. I'd never traveled internationally alone, had always had David or Caroline as companions, navigating unfamiliar territories. Together, the thought of managing airports, trains, and taxis in a country where I spoke only rudimentary French was daunting. Diane, sensing my nervousness, invited me to dinner at her apartment, where she'd prepared a French-inspired meal and decorated her table with lavender sprigs and small Provençal touches. "A practice run," she announced as I arrived, handing me a glass of crisp white wine, "to get you in the mood for your adventure." Over delicious coq au vin, we discussed practical travel matters, electrical adapters, transportation options, how to ask for directions in simple French phrases. But the conversation gradually shifted to deeper territory. "Have you told Caroline the exact dates yet?" Diane asked, refilling our glasses. "You leave in what? 3 weeks?" I nodded, feeling a familiar tightness in my chest. I gave her the full itinerary last week. She didn't say much, just nodded and said she'd make other arrangements for the kids. "And the will changes? Have you mentioned those?" I shook my head, swirling the wine in my glass. "Not yet. It hasn't felt like the right time." Diane raised an eyebrow. "Is there ever going to be a right time to tell your daughter you've significantly reduced her inheritance?" "Probably not," I admitted with a sigh. "But I'd like to wait until after the Provence trip. One major confrontation at a time." "Fair enough," Diane conceded. "But Helen, at some point you're going to have that conversation. Not because Caroline is entitled to know, it's your money and your decision, but because secrets have a way of creating distance in relationships. And despite all the complexities, I know you want a real relationship with your daughter." "I do," I agreed softly. "More than anything. But a different kind of relationship than we've had, one with mutual respect, with give and take, with recognition of each other as complete human beings." The next morning, a Saturday, I drove to Caroline's house for my regular time with the grandchildren. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the curb, a sleek black sedan that looked expensive and new. Emma met me at the door, flinging herself into my arms with her usual enthusiasm. "Grandma, Aunt Isabel is here." I stiffened slightly at the name. Isabel Reynolds was Caroline's college roommate, a woman I'd met only a handful of times over the years. She worked in finance, like Jason, and had always struck me as coldly ambitious, with a brittle laugh and calculating eyes. Caroline had maintained the friendship despite my reservations, occasionally mentioning lunches or shopping trips with Isabel. "How nice," I said, following Emma into the house. "Is she visiting for the day?" "She slept over," Emma reported matter-of-factly. "In the guest room. She brought me a present from New York." I digested this information as we entered the living room, where Caroline, Jason, and a stylishly dressed woman sat drinking coffee. Isabel looked much as I remembered, expensively thin, with highlighted blonde hair cut in a sharp bob. Designer. Clothes that announced their price tag without needing labels. "Helen," she greeted me with that same brittle smile I recalled. "How lovely to see you again." "Isabel," I nodded, turning to Caroline. "I didn't realize you had house guests this weekend." "Last-minute visit," Caroline explained, a strange undertone in her voice. "Isabel was in Boston for a conference and decided to extend her trip to see us." "How fortunate," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Well, I won't disturb your visit. Emma and I have plans at the pottery studio this morning, and then I thought we'd have lunch in the park if the weather holds. Jason stood, lifting Leo from where he'd been playing quietly with blocks on the floor. Actually, Helen, I'm taking Leo to his swim class this morning, and we were hoping you might join us for lunch afterward. All of us, I mean. There's something we'd like to discuss. The formality of his tone, combined with the exchange of glances between him and Caroline, sent a small shiver of apprehension through me. Of course, I agreed. Emma and I can be back by noon. Perfect, Caroline said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We'll see you then. Emma chattered happily as I drove us to the children's pottery studio, showing me the small silver bracelet Isabel had brought her from New York and recounting stories from her kindergarten class. I listened with half an ear, my mind preoccupied with what might be waiting for me at that lunch. The presence of Isabel, the formality of Jason's request, Caroline's strange tone. It all suggested some kind of orchestrated conversation. An intervention, perhaps? The pottery session provided a welcome distraction. Emma proved to have a natural aptitude for the clay, her small fingers shaping a surprisingly symmetrical little bowl that she declared would be for Daddy's keys. I helped her press decorative patterns into the sides using various tools, enjoying her concentration and creativity. You're very good at this, I told her as the instructor took her bowl to be fired. Maybe you'll be a famous artist someday. Emma beamed at the praise. Like you, Grandma. I laughed softly. I'm hardly a famous artist, sweetheart. My pots still wobble. But you made them yourself, she said with the perfect logic of a 6-year-old. That makes them special. As we drove back to her house for the planned lunch, I held those words close. You made them yourself. Simple but profound, an acknowledgement of creation as valuable in itself, regardless of perfection. Perhaps that was what I was doing with this new chapter of my life, making it myself, wobbles and all. When we arrived, the tension in the house was immediately palpable. Caroline was arranging sandwiches on a platter with precise, almost aggressive movements. Jason was setting the table with more formality than a lunch of sandwiches required. Isabel sat at the kitchen island, elegantly poised, watching the proceedings with a small smile that raised my hackles. We're back, I announced, helping. Emma washed the clay residue from her hands at the kitchen sink. Had a wonderful time, didn't we, Emma? Emma nodded enthusiastically, launching into a description of her pottery creation, while Caroline continued arranging food as if each tomato slice required surgical precision. Jason returned from Leo's room, where he'd presumably been putting the toddler down for his nap. Shall we eat? He suggested, gesturing toward the dining room. The meal began with uncomfortable small talk, comments about the weather, questions about Emma's pottery class, Isabel's brief description of her conference in Boston. I waited, sensing the undercurrents, watching Caroline pick at her food while shooting glances at Jason as if waiting for a signal. Finally, as Emma finished her sandwich and asked to be excused to play, Jason cleared his throat. Helen, he began, his tone carefully modulated, we wanted to talk to you about something important, about your recent changes in behavior. I set down my water glass, a calm settling over me despite the confrontational opening. So it was to be an intervention after all. My recent changes in behavior, I repeated. That sounds rather clinical, Jason. Caroline jumped in, her words tumbling out as if she'd been holding them back with great effort. Mom, we're worried. About you. These sudden new interests, the travel plans, the reduced time with the children, it's not like you. We're concerned that you might be going through something. Going through something, I echoed again, looking from Caroline to Jason to Isabel, whose presence in this family discussion still puzzled me. Could you be more specific? A late-life crisis, Isabel offered smoothly, entering the conversation with practiced ease. It's actually quite common, especially in women who've dedicated their lives to family care. There can be a sudden urge to rebel, to seek new experiences, to assert independence in ways that might not always be. I'm well considered. I felt a flare of anger at this armchair psychoanalysis from a virtual stranger, but kept my voice level. And you're an expert in this area, Isabel? She smiled that brittle smile again. I've done some reading, and Caroline has shared her concerns with me. I turned to my daughter, genuinely surprised. You've been discussing me with Isabel? Caroline had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I needed perspective, Mom. Someone who could help me understand what's happening with you. Isabel has a friend who's a therapist and she— I see, I interrupted, a cold clarity washing over me. So the three of you have diagnosed me with a late-life crisis, based on the fact that I've developed interests beyond babysitting and have decided to take a vacation. How concerning indeed. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Helen, that's not fair. We're genuinely worried. This trip to France, alone, at your age. At my age, I repeated, feeling my composure begin to crack. I'm 67, Jason. Not 97. I'm in excellent health, I have all my faculties, and women my age travel solo every day of the week. It's not just the trip, Caroline interjected. It's everything together. The pottery classes, the mysterious appointments, the changes to your schedule with the kids. You're just not yourself anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the calm that had served me well since that night in the attic. Caroline, have you considered that perhaps what you're seeing isn't me becoming someone else, but rather me reclaiming parts of myself that have been submerged for decades? She frowned, genuinely puzzled. What does that even mean? It means, I said carefully, that before I was your mother, before I was David's wife, I was Helen Parker, a woman with interests, ambitions, curiosity about the world. Those aspects of myself didn't disappear when I took on roles of wife and mother. They were just set aside, deprioritized in service to the family I loved. So now we're not a priority anymore? Caroline's voice rose slightly. That's not what I said, I replied evenly. I'm talking about balance, about making room in my life for both my love for you and the grandchildren, and my needs as an individual. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Isabel made a small, dismissive sound. Classic symptoms. The dissatisfaction with established roles, the romanticized view of finding oneself. Next, it will be a sports car and a younger man. I felt something snap within me, not my composure, but rather my willingness to endure this patronizing assessment from someone who had no place in this conversation. Isabel, I said quietly, but firmly, I appreciate that Caroline values your friendship, but this is a family matter. I'd prefer to discuss it with my daughter and son-in-law privately. A flash of something, anger, embarrassment, crossed her perfectly made-up face. I'm only trying to help, Helen. Caroline is concerned about your judgment lately, especially regarding financial matters. I froze, my gaze moving sharply to Caroline. Financial matters? Caroline shot Isabel a warning look before turning, back to me. Mom, Jason and I have been talking, and we think it might be wise if we helped you manage your finances for a while, just until you're feeling more yourself. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Let me understand this correctly, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You believe I'm having some sort of crisis that has impaired my judgment to the point that I need you to control my money? Not control, Jason interjected quickly. Just oversee. Help manage. For your protection. My protection, I repeated. From what, exactly? Bad pottery investments? Excessive spending on French cooking classes? Mom, please, Caroline. pleaded. "We're trying to help. We love you." "If you love me," I said, rising from my chair, "then you'll respect me enough to recognize that I am a competent adult making conscious choices about my own life. Not a doddering elder having a breakdown, not a child needing supervision, and certainly not a bank account for you to oversee." Caroline stood as well, her face flushed. "That's not fair. This isn't about your money." "Isn't it?" I challenged, a sudden insight clicking into place. Isabel's unexpected visit, this carefully staged conversation. "Caroline, did you ask her here specifically to discuss my finances?" The flicker in Caroline's eyes told me everything before she could form a denial. "She has expertise in financial planning," she said defensively, "and she cares about our family." I turned to Isabel, seeing her with new clarity. "What exactly did Caroline tell you about my financial situation?" Isabel maintained her composure, but I detected a hint of discomfort in her shifting posture. "Just that you've been making some unusual decisions lately, that she's concerned about your retirement security." "My retirement security?" I echoed, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Or her inheritance." A heavy silence fell over the table. Jason looked at his plate. Isabel examined her manicure. Only Caroline met my gaze, her expression a complex mixture of guilt and defiance. "We were supposed to be taken care of, Mom," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "You always said everything would come to us, to provide for the children's education, our retirement. That was the plan." The nakedness of it, the raw entitlement laid bare, stunned me into momentary silence. All these years, I told myself that my financial support was about love, about providing opportunities, about helping my daughter and her family thrive. And perhaps that had been true, on my side. But Caroline's words revealed a different understanding, that my money had never really been mine in her eyes, merely a trust she would eventually claim. "Plans change," I said quietly, gathering my purse from where I'd hung it on the chair, "as you've made abundantly clear today." "Mom, wait," Caroline called as I headed for the door. "You can't just leave. We need to talk about this." I paused, turning back to face my daughter, this person I loved more than life itself, and yet suddenly felt I hardly knew at all. "We will talk, Caroline, but not today. Not like this, and certainly not with Isabel present." "Helen," Jason began, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "Jason, I've always respected you as Caroline's choice of partner and as my grandchildren's father. But this ambush was manipulative and deeply disrespectful. I expected better." With that, I walked out, closing the door firmly behind me. In my car, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, I took several deep breaths before starting the engine. The confrontation had been painful, yes, but also clarifying. Like lancing a boil, it had released the poison of unspoken assumptions and expectations that had been festering beneath the surface of our relationship. My phone began ringing almost immediately, Caroline's name flashing on the screen. I declined. The call, then turned the phone off completely. What I needed now was space to process, to determine what this revelation meant for our path forward. I drove without conscious destination, eventually finding myself at the small lakeside park where David and I used to bring Caroline for picnics when she was a child. The April day was mild, the trees just beginning to leaf out in pale green haze. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching ducks navigate the currents, their movements appearing effortless despite the constant adjustments happening beneath the surface. That's what I'd been doing for decades, I realized. Constant adjustments beneath the surface to maintain a smooth family dynamic, subordinating my needs, accommodating Caroline's expectations, avoiding confrontation at all costs. The pattern had seemed natural, necessary even, part of the tacit contract of motherhood. But today had shown me the true cost of that contract, not just to me, but to Caroline herself, who had grown into a woman who could arrange an ambush with a financial consultant to discuss taking control of her mother's assets. Where had I gone so wrong? What lessons had I inadvertently taught her through my constant yielding, my reflexive self-sacrifice? That love meant erasure of boundaries? That a mother's value lay primarily in what she could provide materially and practically? The afternoon light began to fade, the spring chill intensifying as the sun lowered toward the horizon. I turned my phone back on to find multiple missed calls and text messages from Caroline, ranging from angry, "I can't believe you just walked out," to tearful, "Mom, please call me, I'm worried," to defensive, "You're not being fair, we were trying," to help. The last message, sent just 20 minutes earlier, caught my attention. "I found the will changes, Mom. How could you?" My breath caught. The changes to my will were indeed finalized, the documents safely stored in my home office. Caroline had no access to my apartment, which meant the realization hit like a physical blow. Rebecca. Caroline must have contacted Rebecca directly, perhaps claiming to be checking on my behalf, perhaps simply leveraging their past acquaintance to extract information. I'd underestimated her determination to maintain control of the narrative and of my assets. I called Rebecca immediately, my voice tight with controlled anger as I explained the situation. "Helen, I'm so sorry." Rebecca sounded genuinely distressed. "Caroline called the office claiming you'd asked her to pick up copies of the will documents. When the receptionist couldn't find any record of such a request, Caroline insisted there must be a misunderstanding, that you were expecting these documents for an important meeting. She was very convincing. Convincing enough that confidential, legal documents were released to someone other than the client." Rebecca's sigh carried through the phone. "The receptionist is new, and Caroline can be persuasive. I've already addressed this as a serious breach of protocol. It will never happen again." I closed my eyes, fighting the dual waves of betrayal from my daughter's deception and from the violation of my private legal affairs. "It's not your fault, Rebecca. I should have anticipated something like this. Caroline has never responded well to boundaries." After ending the call, I sat in my car for a long moment, considering my options. I could return Caroline's calls, engage in what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged discussion about the will changes. I could go home and pretend not to have received her messages, postponing the inevitable confrontation. Or I could face this head-on, on my terms rather, than hers. The decision, when it came, felt right, a continuation of the path I'd been walking since that night in the attic. I started the car and drove toward Caroline's house, calling Diane briefly en route to explain the situation. "Do you want me to come with you?" she offered immediately. "For moral support?" "Thank you, but no," I replied, touched by her loyalty. "This is between Caroline and me. It's a conversation that's long overdue." When I pulled into Caroline's driveway for the second time that day, the sleek black sedan was gone. Isabel had apparently departed after her financial consultation services were no longer required. The house looked peaceful in the early evening light, windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. I rang the doorbell, hearing the familiar chimes echo through the house. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Jason, his expression caught between surprise and wariness. "Helen," he said, stepping back to allow me entry. "We didn't expect you back today." "I understand Caroline has some questions about my will," I replied evenly, moving past him into the foyer. "I thought it best to address them directly." Jason ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd rarely seen from him. "She's upset, Helen. I've never seen her like this." "I imagine finding out you won't be receiving the windfall you've been counting on would be upsetting," I said, my tone neutral despite the sharpness of the words. He winced. "It's not like that. Not entirely, anyway." "Then what is it like, Jason?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Because from where I stand, it looks very much like my daughter arranged a financial intervention because she's concerned about her inheritance. Before he could respond, Caroline appeared in the doorway to the living room, her face blotchy from crying, a sheaf of papers clutched in her hand. The will documents. "How could you do this?" she demanded, without preamble waving the papers. "After everything, after all these years of promises?" I remained calm, removing my coat and hanging it on the foyer hook as if this were any normal visit. "Shall we sit down and discuss this civilly, Caroline? Or would you prefer to continue, shouting in the entryway?" She stared at me for a moment, then turned abruptly and stalked back into the living room. I followed, noting that the children were nowhere to be seen, likely upstairs with a movie or video game, kept deliberately away from the adult drama unfolding below. The living room showed signs of Caroline's emotional state, tissues crumpled. On the coffee table, a half-empty glass of what looked like scotch, the will documents spread across the sofa where she must have been reviewing them obsessively. I took a seat in the armchair across from her, folding my hands in my lap. "I understand you have questions about my estate planning decisions." "Questions?" Caroline's laugh was harsh, unfamiliar. "You've cut me out of most of my inheritance, and you think I have questions? Mom, you've betrayed us. After everything we've done for you, everything we've been to each other." The accusation stung, but I maintained my composure. "I haven't cut you out, Caroline. You're still receiving 25% of my estate, a substantial sum by any measure. The difference is that now the grandchildren have protected trusts for their education, and there are provisions for charitable causes I believe in, as well as for Diane, who has been family to me for decades." "Diane," Caroline spat the name. "Of course. Your new best friend who encourages all this. This rebellion. She's the reason for all this, isn't she?" I shook my head, disappointed but not surprised by Caroline's attempt to externalize blame. "Diane has been supportive of my choices, yes, but these decisions are mine alone, made after careful consideration of my values and priorities." "Your priorities," Caroline echoed bitterly. "Which apparently no longer include your only daughter and her family." "That's not true, and you know it," I replied firmly. "I love you and the children more than anything, but love doesn't mean I'm obligated to give you everything I've worked for, especially when I've already provided so much. Your education, your wedding, the down payment on this house, years of free childcare, constant financial support." Caroline flinched as if struck. "So now you're keeping score, throwing your generosity in my face?" "I'm not keeping score," I said quietly. "I'm establishing perspective. You're acting as if I've abandoned you destitute, when in reality I've simply made choices about my own assets that don't center you as the primary beneficiary." She rose from the sofa, pacing the room with agitated steps. "But why now? Why after all these years of telling us everything would come to us? We've made plans based on those expectations, Mom. Financial plans." The naked admission surprised me with its candor. "You've been making financial plans based on my death?" Caroline had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, but quickly rallied. "Not like that. But yes, we've considered your estate in our long-term planning. You always said it would be substantial, that we'd never have to worry about retirement or the kids' college. And now, suddenly, 3/4 of it is going elsewhere." I studied my daughter, this woman I'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, and saw with painful clarity how my well-intentioned support had fostered an attitude of entitlement rather than gratitude. The fault was not hers alone. I had participated in creating this dynamic through years of unchecked giving. "Caroline," I said gently, "my money is mine to allocate as I see fit. I've provided generously for you throughout your life and will continue to do so while I'm alive. The inheritance you'll receive is still significant, but I've decided that other priorities, the grandchildren's direct educational support, causes I believe in, people who have shown me genuine care, deserve recognition as well. And this has nothing to do with Thanksgiving? She challenged, her voice rising. With the attic room? Is this punishment for not giving you the guest room? I sighed, feeling a deep weariness. This isn't about punishment, Caroline. The will changes were already in process before Thanksgiving. But yes, the attic experience was clarifying. It showed me with painful clarity how peripheral I've become in your life. How little my comfort and dignity seem to factor into your decisions. That's not fair, she protested. It was one weekend, one time we asked you to make an accommodation. It was a symptom of a larger pattern, I interrupted. A pattern where my needs consistently come last, where my role is defined primarily by what I can provide to you and your family. And that same pattern is playing out right now, in your reaction to my financial decisions. Caroline stopped pacing, turning to face me with an expression of genuine bewilderment. What do you mean? I mean, I said carefully, that your concern doesn't seem to be about me, about my happiness, my fulfillment, my right to live my remaining years with purpose and joy. It's about what my choices mean for you, the inconvenience of reduced childcare, the disappointment of a smaller inheritance. When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, Caroline? What would make me happy? The question hung in the air between us, unanswerable. Caroline sank back onto the sofa, the fight seeming to drain from her posture. I don't understand what's happening, she said finally, her voice small. You're not the mother I've known my whole life. Perhaps not, I agreed. Or perhaps I'm becoming more fully myself, the woman who existed before motherhood consumed my identity, and who still exists alongside the mother you know. Caroline looked up, something vulnerable flickering in her eyes. I don't know how to relate to this version of you. The admission held a raw honesty that touched me. I know, I said softly. And I don't expect you to adjust overnight. All I'm asking is that you try. That you make space for me to be more than just your mother and the children's grandmother. That you recognize my right to make decisions based on my own needs and values, even when those decisions don't center you. Jason, who had been silent throughout our exchange, finally spoke from where he'd been standing near the doorway. She's right, Caroline. Caroline turned to him, betrayal written across her features. Whose side are you on? There shouldn't be sides, he replied, coming to sit beside her on the sofa. Your mother isn't an adversary. She's a person making reasonable choices about her own life and resources. I felt a surge of unexpected gratitude toward Jason, seeing him in a new light, not just as Caroline's husband or my grandchildren's father, but as an individual capable of perspective and fairness. The trust for the kids' education is actually a smart move, he continued, placing a hand on Caroline's knee. It protects that money specifically for their future, regardless of what financial challenges we might face. Caroline looked from Jason to me, confusion and hurt still evident in her expression. I just don't understand why everything has to change. We were happy with the way things were. You were happy, I corrected gently. I was. Accommodating. There's a difference. So you've been unhappy all this time? Resenting us? The sob heard in her voice was genuine. No, I said firmly. I've loved being part of your lives, watching the children grow, sharing in your world. But I've also been unconsciously diminishing myself, setting aside my own needs and interests so completely that when I finally began to reclaim them, it felt to you like a personality transplant. Caroline was quiet for a long moment, seemingly absorbing my words. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, though still tinged with emotion. The trip to France, she said. You're still planning to go? I nodded. In 3 weeks. The cooking course is paid for, the accommodations arranged. And after that, What other changes should we expect? The question held both resignation and a tentative openness. I chose my words carefully, wanting to be honest without inflicting unnecessary pain. I don't know exactly, I admitted. I'm still discovering what this new chapter looks like. But I know it includes continuing to be a loving presence in your lives while also nurturing my own interests and relationships. It means finding a sustainable balance rather than the one-sided giving that's characterized our relationship for too long. Caroline nodded slowly, her eyes on the will documents still scattered across the coffee table. I can't pretend I'm not disappointed about this, she said, gesturing to the papers, or that I understand all these changes you're making. But I don't want to lose you, Mom. The fear in her voice, that fundamental anxiety of a child facing an unpredictable shift in their parent, moved me deeply. I rose from my chair and came to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in mine. You're not losing me, Caroline, I assured her softly. If anything, you're gaining a more authentic version of me, one who can love you without losing herself in the process. That's healthier for both of us in the long run. She didn't respond verbally, but didn't pull her hand away either. A small victory in what I knew would be a long process of redefinition and healing. The road ahead would not be smooth. Decades of established patterns couldn't be transformed in a single conversation, no matter how honest. But we had taken the first crucial step, acknowledging the reality of our dynamic and the necessity of change. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation had been painful but necessary, bringing into the open issues that had festered beneath the surface for years. Whether Caroline could ultimately accept and adapt to the changes in our relationship remained to be seen. But for perhaps the first time, I had stood firmly in my truth, without flinching, without accommodating, without placing her comfort above my own integrity. The woman who had slept in that cold attic months ago, feeling peripheral and taken for granted, had found her voice. And regardless of how Caroline chose to respond to that voice, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I could never return to silence. Provence in May was everything I had dreamed of and more. Rolling hills blanketed in lavender, not yet in full bloom, but promising their future glory. Ancient stone villages perched on hillsides, markets bursting with produce so vibrant it seemed almost artificial after American supermarkets. The cooking school occupied a renovated farmhouse with honey-colored stone walls and blue shutters, surrounded by herb gardens that perfumed the air with rosemary, thyme, and sage. I arrived with trepidation, still adjusting to solo travel after a lifetime of companionship. The flight had been long, the train connections confusing, the taxi driver impatient with my halting French. But the moment I stepped through the gates of the cooking school and saw the 12 other participants, mostly women, mostly my age or older, all with the same mixture of excitement and nervousness in their eyes, I felt a sense of homecoming I hadn't anticipated. First time traveling alone? Asked a woman with silver-streaked dark hair and an Australian accent as we gathered for the welcome reception. Her name tag read, Margaret. Is it that obvious? I laughed, accepting a glass of local rosé from a passing server. Only to another first-timer, she replied with a conspiratorial wink. I've been promising myself this trip for 20 years. Finally decided, if not now, when? Her words resonated deeply. If not now, when? At 67, with reasonably good health but no guarantees for the future? Wasn't that precisely the question that had propelled me from that cold attic into this sun-drenched courtyard? The week unfolded with a gentle rhythm. Morning market visits to select ingredients. Midday cooking classes where we learned to prepare bouillabaisse, ratatouille, tapenade, and other Provençal classics. Afternoons free for exploration or rest. Evenings gathered around long tables laden with our creations and local wines. I discovered a natural affinity for pastry. my hands seeming to know instinctively how to work the butter into delicate pâte brisée for quiche Lorraine, or how to fold the layers for perfect croissants. "You have the touch," our instructor, Michel, observed as I crimped the edges of a tarte aux pommes. "Some people force the dough. You listen to it." The compliment warmed me in a way that felt novel, appreciation for a skill entirely my own, unrelated to my roles as mother or grandmother or supportive friend, just Helen, with capable hands and an intuitive feel for pastry. In the afternoons, I sometimes joined small groups from the class to explore nearby villages or wineries, but often chose to venture out alone. There was a heady freedom in setting my own pace, in lingering over paintings in a small gallery without worrying about someone else's boredom, in sitting at a cafe with a book and watching the world pass by for as long as I pleased. I thought of Caroline, of course, wondering what she was doing, how the children were managing without my regular presence, whether our confrontation before my departure had led to any shift in her perspective. We had spoken briefly once, a slightly strained phone call where she assured me everything was fine, and I shared carefully selected highlights of my experience. Not the depth of emotion I was feeling, not the profound sense of reconnection with myself that was occurring day by day, but simple tourist observations about the beauty of the countryside and the deliciousness of the food. Midway through the AOD, Week, Margaret, and two other women from the class, Judith from Toronto and Elaine from Chicago, suggested an excursion to a ceramics workshop in a neighboring village. "Since you mentioned your pottery classes back home," Margaret explained, "thought you might be interested." The village of Saint-Remy clung to a hillside, its narrow streets barely wide enough for our rental car to navigate. The ceramics studio occupied a former wine cellar, the ancient stone walls now lined with shelves displaying pottery in every imaginable form, practical dinner plates in earthy tones, whimsical sculptures of local wildlife, decorative tiles, painted with Provençal scenes. The potter, a weathered man named Antoine with hands like gnarled olive branches, demonstrated his techniques while his wife Marie translated his rapid French into approximate English. When he invited us to try our hands at the wheel, the others demurred, but I stepped forward with an eagerness that surprised even me. "You have done this before," Antoine observed through Marie as I centered the clay with practiced movements. "A little," I admitted, "but I'm still very much a beginner." He watched as I worked, occasionally murmuring suggestions or gently correcting my hand position. Under his guidance, I created a small bowl with a graceful curve that surpassed anything I'd achieved in my classes back home. "C'est bon," he declared when I finished, inspecting my work with a critical eye. "Not perfect, but honest. It speaks truth." As we left the studio, my newly purchased bowl carefully wrapped in newspaper and nestled in my bag, Judith remarked, "You looked so at peace there, Helen, like you'd found your element." The observation stayed with me through the remainder of the trip, resonating with something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. Peace. A settling into myself that went beyond the pleasure of travel or the satisfaction of learning new skills. A fundamental realignment with my own truth after decades of compromise and accommodation. On my final evening in Provence, I sat alone on the terrace of the farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and amber. Michel, passing by with an armload of fresh herbs for the farewell dinner, paused beside my chair. "You will return to Provence, yes?" he asked in his charmingly accented English. I smiled up at him. "I hope so. It's been transformative." He nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Of course, Provence has this effect, but perhaps it is not Provence that transforms. Perhaps it is only that here, away from the familiar, we finally see ourselves clearly. His words echoed in my mind during the long journey home, the flight to Boston, the taxi to my apartment building, the strange disorientation of returning to familiar surroundings as a subtly changed person. My apartment felt simultaneously welcoming and slightly foreign, as if it belonged to a previous version of myself who no longer quite existed. I unpacked slowly, placing the ceramic bowl from Saint-Remy on my coffee table, arranging small jars of herbs and spices from the Provençal markets on my kitchen shelf, pinning postcards of lavender fields and ancient villages to my bulletin board. Physical reminders that the experience had been real, that the woman who had walked those hills and kneaded that pastry and shaped that clay was truly me. Diane came by that evening, bearing takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and eager for first-hand accounts of my adventure. "You look different," she declared, studying me across the coffee table as we ate pad Thai from cardboard containers. "Somehow more present." I considered this. "I feel different, more solid in myself, if that makes sense. Less apologetic about taking up space in the world." She nodded, understanding immediately as she always did. "Have you spoken with Caroline since you've been back?" "Not yet," I admitted. "She knows I arrived safely. I texted when I landed. But I haven't called. I needed a day to decompress, to reintegrate. And to prepare for the inevitable questions about when you'll resume your regular grandchild duties." Diane's tone was light, but knowing. I smiled ruefully. That too. Though honestly, I'm hoping our conversation before I left made some impact. She seemed at least willing to consider that things need to change. "Well, you'll find out soon enough," Diane said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "To your triumphant return, world traveler, and to whatever comes next." What came next began the following morning with a text message from Caroline. "Kids are asking for you. Maybe dinner at our place tonight if you're up for it?" The invitation was casual, non-demanding, a marked departure from her typical assumption of my availability. I texted back. "Would love to. 6:30? When I arrived at Caroline's house that evening, bearing small gifts from France for everyone, a wooden toy train for Leo, a watercolor set for Emma, a cookbook for Caroline, artisanal mustards for Jason, the atmosphere was noticeably different from my previous visits. No underlying tension, no sense of walking on eggshells, just a normal family dinner with the children chattering about school events and Jason asking genuinely interested questions about my trip. Caroline was quieter than usual, watching me, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher as I described the cooking classes and the ceramics workshop. When the children had been excused from the table and Jason had taken them upstairs for bath time, she finally spoke directly. "You seem different, Mom. Happy. Confident." I nodded, acknowledging the observation. "I feel that way. The trip was wonderful, but it's more than that. It's about finding parts of myself that got buried over the years." Caroline traced the rim of her wine glass with one finger, her gaze fixed on the motion. "I've been thinking a lot while you were gone. About our conversation before you left, about the will changes, about everything, really." I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "I was angry," she admitted, "and hurt. I felt like you were pulling away from us, like our relationship suddenly wasn't important to you anymore." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. But Jason said something that made me think. He asked me when was the last time I had a conversation with you that wasn't about the kids, or what you could do for us. And I couldn't remember. The simple acknowledgement brought a lump to my throat. "It's been a while," I agreed softly. "That's not right, Mom. That's not fair to you." Caroline's voice wavered slightly. "I got so used to you always being there, always helping, always giving, that I stopped seeing you as a person with your own needs and desires. I just saw you as an extension of our family system, a resource." The painful honesty of her words hung between us. Not an accusation, not a defense, just a recognition of the reality we had co-created over years of established patterns. "I let that happen," I said gently. "I participated in creating that dynamic. The change needs to come from both of us. Caroline nodded, blinking back tears. I want that change. I want to know you, the real you, not just my mother. I want Emma and Leo to know their grandmother as a whole person with her own life and interests. She attempted a smile through her tears. I want to hear about your pottery classes and your trip to France and whatever else you decide to do, not because it affects our schedule, but because I'm genuinely interested in your happiness. I reached across the table to take her hand, feeling the familiar softness of her skin against mine. So many memories in that touch. Caroline as a newborn, her tiny fingers curling around my thumb. As a little girl, her hand trustingly in mine as we crossed streets. As a bride, her manicured hand trembling slightly as I adjusted her veil. And now, as an adult woman, reaching toward me across the divide we had allowed to grow between us. I would like that very much, I said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. To rebuild our relationship as adults, as women with separate but connected lives. It might be awkward at first, she warned, returning the squeeze. I'm not sure I know how to do this. Neither do I admitted with a small laugh. We'll figure it out together. Jason returned downstairs then, reporting that the children were bathed and in pajamas, waiting for me to say goodnight before their bedtime story. As I climbed the stairs to their rooms, I felt a lightness in my step that had nothing to do with the physical exertion and everything to do with the conversation that had just occurred. Emma was sitting up in bed, her dark hair still damp from the bath, her face lighting up as I entered. Grandma, did you really bring me paints from France? I sat on the edge of her bed, opening the small watercolor set I'd purchased in a charming art supply store in Avignon. I did. And guess what? The woman who sold them to me said these are the same kind of paints that famous artists used to use to paint pictures of the French countryside. Her eyes widened as she ran her fingers over the neat rows of color. Will you teach me how to use them? Like a real artist? I'd love to, I told her. Maybe we could have a special art day soon. Just you and me. Not Leo? She confirmed, ever the older sibling guarding her privileges. Leo can have his own special day with other activities, I assured her. This will be our grandmother-granddaughter project. She nodded solemnly, then asked with the directness only children truly master, Are you still mad at Mommy? I considered my answer carefully. I was never mad at your mommy, Emma. We had a disagreement about some things, but we've talked about it and we're working it out. That's what people who love each other do. They talk honestly about problems and find solutions together. She seemed satisfied with this explanation, settling back against her pillows as I leaned down to kiss her forehead. I'm glad you're back, Grandma. I missed you. I missed you too, sweetheart. But you know what? It's good for people to have adventures sometimes, to go places and learn new things, even grandmas. Even mommies? She asked sleepily. Especially mommies, I confirmed, thinking of Caroline downstairs, perhaps standing at the threshold of her own journey toward fuller selfhood. In Leo's room, the conversation was simpler, exclamations over the wooden train, demonstrations of its moving parts, a story about the toy maker in the French village where I'd purchased it. He was half asleep by the time I kissed him goodnight, his eyelids heavy, one small hand still clutching the train. Downstairs, Caroline and Jason were clearing the dinner dishes, moving around each other with the comfortable choreography of a long partnership. I joined them, falling into the familiar rhythm of family cleanup, but with a subtle difference. I was helping not out of obligation or expectation, but from choice. A small distinction, perhaps, but profound in its implications. As I prepared to leave, Caroline walked me to the door, hanging back slightly as Jason took the children's thank you drawings to my car. Mom, she said hesitantly, I've been thinking about your pottery classes. I wondered if, maybe sometime, I could come with you, just to watch, or maybe try it myself. The request, so unexpected and yet so perfectly aligned with the new understanding we were building, brought a sudden warmth to my chest. I'd love that, Caroline. The next session starts in 2 weeks, Thursday evenings. I'll arrange for Jason to handle bedtime that night, she said. And in those simple words, I heard the effort she was making, to see me as separate from her family's needs, to adapt her schedule to mine rather than the reverse. Driving home, through the quiet evening streets, I reflected on the strange, circuitous path that had led me here. From that cold attic room where I'd felt so peripheral and taken for granted, to this moment of genuine connection and mutual respect with my daughter. The changes in my will remained. The boundaries I'd established still stood, but they no longer felt like weapons in a family Cold War. Rather, they were structural supports for a healthier relationship, one built on recognition of each other's full humanity rather than on roles and expectations. At home, I moved through my nighttime routine with a sense of contentment that went bone deep. Hanging my clothes in the closet, I caught sight of the travel book still on my bedside table. Provence, now experienced and cherished, but also Tuscany, Greece, Scotland, all places that called to some adventurous part of me I was only beginning to know. Next to the book sat the pottery bowl from Saint-Remy, its glazed surface catching the lamplight. Not perfect, but honest, Antoine had said. It speaks truth. As I slipped between my cool sheets, I thought about truth. The truth of who I was beyond my roles, the truth of what I wanted for my remaining years, the truth of relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. The journey toward those truths had begun in an uncomfortable attic room during a holiday weekend, a seemingly small indignity that had cracked open decades of accumulated patterns and expectations. Caroline still didn't know the full story, that the will changes had begun before that Thanksgiving, that the attic experience had been a crystallizing moment rather than a direct cause. Perhaps someday I would share that with her, or perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were both awakening to new possibilities, finding our way toward a relationship that honored both our connection and our separateness. Tomorrow, I would call Diane and tell her about the dinner, about Caroline's request to join the pottery class, about the small but significant shifts I'd observed. I would check my calendar and select dates for the promised art day with Emma and a separate outing with Leo. I would research ceramic studios in Tuscany, considering a possible trip for the fall. But for now, in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I simply allowed myself to feel the fullness of the moment. The journey completed, the lessons integrated, the future opening before me like a road winding through Provençal hills. Its destination, unknown but promising. The woman who had slept in that cold attic months ago, feeling diminished and taken for granted, had embarked on a pilgrimage of sorts, not just to France, but to herself. And while the path had sometimes been difficult, involving confrontation and painful truths, it had led to this place of hard-won peace and authenticity. My last thought before drifting into sleep was of the small ceramic bowl I'd created under Antoine's guidance. Not perfect, but honest. Speaking truth. Much like the life I was now consciously shaping. Imperfect, certainly. Messy at times, but finally, blessedly, my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.